So what we're going to do here is walk through the frequently made mistakes that I've seen up to this point. The assignment is due tonight. If you have submitted it and haven't addressed these mistakes, please go back and address those if I haven't already reviewed your code. If you haven't submitted your code, make sure you watch this stuff and make sure you fix these things before you submit it. If you don't do that, then your code will not be reviewed because we're already going over this once. I don't want to have to do it multiple times. I have a little comment in some places just mentioning this is not a mistake. We're going to refactor the database sync proxy implementation in assignment 2B, so just be prepared for that. You might think about all the redundancy that's in it right now and how that could be addressed, and we're going to talk about that next. Make sure when you implement your client beans in the client that you implement the add converter factory correctly for both of your factory methods, both the one that creates the database API and the one that creates the timer API. This one is the one I've seen a few people make a mistake. This is incorrect. Read the comments carefully. The specification, it explains what to do. If you don't do it correctly, if you do this, you will get really weird results coming out of the timer. And the reason I know that is because I made that mistake at first, and I got really weird results, and it took me a few minutes and a little help from ChatGPT to narrow this down, but that's basically incorrect. So read the specification, you'll see what to do. A whole bunch of problems exist in the Retrofit API stuff. And there's pros and cons to using Retrofit. The nice thing about Retrofit is you don't have to write the proxies by hand. You let Retrofit do it for you using the magic of reflection and so on. The downside is you've got to get the annotations correct. And if you don't get the annotations correct, chaos and insanity will ensue. And the tricky part there is that the annotations aren't really checked by the compiler. So it can be hard to figure out when you don't get them right. But that's the point of this assignment, is to figure out how to do that. And again, ChatGPT is your friend here. It will help you. If you give it the code from the controller, it should tell you what those annotations should be. So just make sure you're consistent when you follow its advice. So here, a lot of problems with search, this version of search that takes a query string. The path name is wrong. There's a very subtle bug here. If you look carefully, you'll see what the bug is that's wrong. And this is the wrong parameter to use. Don't use query. Even though the name of the parameter is query, you don't use query. You have to use a different thing. And again, ChatGPT should tell you what to do. There's another problem here. This is also the wrong parameter to pass in there, so don't do it that way. And this is also the wrong search string here as well. So you have to look and make sure you understand how that works. Down here, the path variable is ordered incorrectly. You need to make sure that the name of the name of what you want comes before the name of the method, and that's because that's the way the controller is designed. Once again, if you use ChatGPT to generate this stuff, it should get it right for you. So once again, making a plug for automated tools. Down here, the timed path is not being set correctly. There's some other issues here. There's some stuff missing, so look carefully. And when you get these kinds of mistakes, they're usually pretty easy to spot because you should get an error message on the client side that shows a malformed URL that's being attempted to be sent to the server. And so you should look at it carefully and see what's missing. So there's something missing here. All right, so a bunch of subtle problems with using Retrofit. You just have to learn how to use your tools correctly. That's the overarching theme. A couple things here with the proxy, the client sync proxy code. This is a little bit too concise. It doesn't really implement the spec. It doesn't do the right things that the spec asks for. And down here, whenever you start finding yourself writing, super duper long variable things, that's probably a good place to try to use var, because it should make it a little bit more concise. All right, now let's turn our attention to the database repository stuff. Most people got that right. Good job. A couple problems here. This is too concise. You're missing the ignore case part of it. And this, I think, is just maybe a little bit too verbose. This will probably work correctly for assignment 2B, but I don't think assignment 2A is expecting the movies to come back in sorted order. I could be wrong about that, but if you're getting weird results, that's probably why. For 2B, that will be the way, because I was more consistent. But most people are doing well for the generated code. That's a good job. Make sure that so now we're moving on to the movie class. First of all, make sure you implement the movie class and fill in the to-dos. This is missing some stuff, like it's not implementing the right interface. And then there's a bunch of subtle issues with the compare and equals operators. So a couple things. You're probably not going to have your tests fail for assignment 2A because the tests weren't done in a thorough way. For assignment 2B, they're done in a much more thorough way. So I'm just giving you a heads up for next time, and if you do that now, you'll be prepared for next time. So I recommend, first of all, make sure you use case-insensitive comparison as opposed to compare to. And the reason for that is we want to make sure the movies come back in the right order. And this is used by the sorting operation in streams, or if you use a tree set, rather, you'll end up having this used as well. So you want to do a case-insensitive comparison. And this is not wrong, but I would recommend you use compare to ignore case to do that rather than lowercasing these things. I think lowercasing this stuff probably has a bit more overhead that we don't really need to have. This implementation of equals is incorrect. Once again, if you want to know how to write a correct implementation of equals, you could look at Stack Overflow. You could try through painful trial and error, or you could crank up ChatGPT and give it the movies class definition, and then ask it, could you please generate a compare to method for me? And it will happily do that. Now, it may not give you the most elegant way of doing it. It'll probably give you the way that's the out-of-the-box way that it's been trained on, because it's been trained on lots of Java code. There are maybe better ways to do it, but it will be correct, and I don't think this is correct. So it's definitely not what you want in this case. So once again, use your tools, and your life will be so much better. If you learn nothing else in this class, remember that. Down here, for equals, you don't need to use ignore case. Now, in some circumstances, you might, but in our movie database, we have distinct capitalization for all the movies. So there's nowhere, you're not going to see Star Wars lowercase and Star Wars uppercase or mixed case being confused for each other. They're all unique. So we don't have to do ignore case, which will make it a little bit faster. Also, despite the comments in the specification, you don't need to compare the vectors, just the IDs. I've fixed that in the next version, because we don't want to have to, if you look at the vectors that contain the encoding are like 360 elements per vector. No need to compare that. All we want to do is basically check to see whether the strings are equal, not the vectors. All right, now let's move into the database service method. This is the one where most people have mistakes that they should be fixing by watching these videos. So what I'm doing now when I review code, I go first and look at that file. If you haven't addressed the things we've covered, I'm not reviewing your code. So make sure you start by fixing the things here. OK, first of all, for the search method, please don't call the list search method from the string query search method. That's way inefficient. This is much faster to use the appropriate JPA method. In fact, you probably want to reverse things. You probably want the search list method to call to that method. So you put the appropriate JPA method query here in search with one string, and then you can call that method. That's the right way to order things. All right, now let's take a look at the one that's driving everybody crazy. And we're going to spend some time on this because it's really a lot more subtle than you might expect. And I've spent some time figuring out why it's a lot more subtle, and I'll explain that in a minute. So first of all, you don't need to have stream support stream queries.splitterator, comma, true. Just say dot parallel stream. Much more concise. So that needs to be fixed. Second, you don't need to have map followed by flat map, but instead you can just use flat map, although we'll talk about the tricky parts with flat map in a second. So this code will work, but it's probably better to do it other ways. Next, really important thing. Don't put .sequential in this stream. And the reason for that is the way streams work is you can start out with something in either sequential or parallel mode. And then at some point along the way, if you choose, you can change it from parallel to sequential or sequential to parallel. Usually you go from sequential to parallel, by the way. But what happens in streams is whichever one is the last one in the stream, the whole stream is handled that way. Very confusing. And it might have behaved differently at some point, but that's not the way it behaves now. So when you do .sequential here, you're making the whole thing sequential. So in order for this to work, you need to split it into two parts. You need to do a part that's the parallel part, save that as a list in a local variable, and then do a part that's the sequential part. If you want to use flat map, that's the way to go, and we'll talk about why that is in a second. Next problem. Irrespective of what you do, make sure you put sorted before distinct. So you have to sort them first and then do distinct, and we'll talk more about why that is in a second. Sorted and distinct have different characteristics when used in this way, and so you want to make sure something's sorted before you check to see if they're distinct, because otherwise you're going to end up with duplicates. And you know you have duplicates if your client test fails with a message like expected 91 got 109. If you get that error, it's probably because something's gone awry here. Next problem. Make sure that you implement the compare to method in movie and then remove compare ID here, because this will also end up giving you weird results. It won't take out the duplicates and so on, because it's not going to do a case-insensitive comparison. So sort, remove the compare ID, remove anything, just sort it, and make sure that you have the compare to method implemented properly. OK, so this is one way to do things. And then there's a clever approach here, but it gave me a great inspiration, but it's actually not quite right, but it's on the right track, and we'll talk more about that in a second. So what happened here, the person who did this didn't have the call to distinct up in their code, so they put stuff into a list. Then what they did is they made a hash set, and then they went through and added everything from the list into the hash set, which of course will make it unique, because a set doesn't have duplicates. And then they returned that as a list. So I saw this code, I was like, that's pretty clever, and we're going to come back and talk more about that in a little bit. But for this particular use case, it's probably overkill, because it's easier to do the distinct mechanism up there. OK, so make sure that you get this code working correctly and that you look back at your code and fix these things. The other problem people are doing, well, you should split your code up into two parts if you use flat map. Let's see, a couple more things. Please make sure that you have the particular implementation for this assignment 2A done, where we're using queries as the unit of concurrency, not movies. And I'll talk about that in a second. This particular approach does it the other way around. It's using movies as the unit of concurrency, followed by queries. But we want to do queries as the unit of concurrency with movies done inside of them. And the reason for doing that is what we're going to be doing next assignment is replacing a lot of this stuff with an actual call to a single database operation that will do this all for you that you will write. So we're just getting kind of warmed up for that. And then last thing, I think this is probably beating a dead horse. Just make sure you make the right calls in the assignment 1C implementation piece, the movies EX stuff, to use the helper method on future utils. If you don't do that, you're going to get an error when you run the test. So that would be pretty easy to fix. OK, so that's the end of my overview of frequently made mistakes. Please make sure, I'm going to put this video up right after class. Please make sure you watch this and you understand it, because your assignment is going to depend a lot on that.